All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our last week of class as well as our last class session. So hope everyone's doing well and your week's off to a good start. This is our last session, so we have a couple of things on the agenda tonight. I did change up some of our information just to kind of give you a truncated version so I can make sure we get through everything and also be able to wrap up a lot of material and pull things together in this evening's session. So as you may have noticed, we looked at the Canvas site, the slides changed a little bit in terms of the week 8 slides. So just be mindful of that. But again, I want to make sure we got through everything tonight. Just as a reminder that you have until Friday, I guess that's Friday, right? The 21st at midnight to turn in your chosen solution paper as well as your final Canvas posting. The final Canvas posting is just a synopsis of your chosen solution. So it's kind of two different assignments, but you're doing the same thing for both of them. For the chosen solution paper, remember what you're doing is you're going to give me a title page, then you'll include your revised background paper if any revisions were needed. If you didn't get any recommendations and there are no recommended revisions, then you can submit it as you originally submitted it. Then you'll also submit your revised alternative solutions paper. Again, if you didn't have any revisions or recommendations, you can just submit it as is. And the new section you'll be adding will be your chosen solution section. Again, you can do that relatively quickly, maybe 1 or 2 pages. I think that's probably going to be sufficient, maybe 3, whatever it takes you to do, where you'll be selecting one or perhaps a combination of your solutions and then providing a justification. Then if you have any references, you'll then also want to include a reference page. Brunel, go ahead.
Hi, yes, when we submit the first two, are we submitting all 3 under the same chosen link, or are we going to the alternative, resubmitting the alternative, going, to one link?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. They all get submitted under the chosen solution link. So all submitted under that one link.
All right, three documents. And even if we have no changes, still just upload it.
Yeah, well, it would be good if you could combine them all together into just one document. You don't have to rewrite them to make it flow, but just combine them together into one document. So you've got your title page, then your revised background paper, revised alternative solutions paper, and then your chosen solution section, whatever solution you're selecting and why.
So we are going to do one title page and add all the references from each one just to the one doc?
Yes, exactly. Just all in one document.
Oh, all right. All right.
Yeah, and like I said, you don't have to go back and rewrite it to kind of make it flow or anything. Just literally, you just have to put the papers in there in one document. And where I'll focus most of my attention, obviously, will be on that last part, the chosen solution part, because I've read the first 2 papers already. So, my focus will be on that chosen solution. And again, you can select one of your 3. You might use 2 of the 3. Some people in the past have combined all 3 together and do a hybrid approach. Just justify why that's the most appropriate approach to use to address the problem, and then you're good to go. So, okay. Any other questions on the chosen solution paper or the final Canvas essay?
Professor, I have a question. So you are saying that send the 3 pieces together. So it's okay, for example, is we separate each one of the sections with, I don't know, put section 1, section 2, section 3, something like that, or you want just be all together without any separation in between?
Oh, no, it's good to use headings, so you just put a heading. You can put a heading section 1, you can call it, revised background paper, but yes, put headings in for each of the 3 sections.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. If anything occurs to you between now and when the paper is due on Friday, I know a few people have already turned it in, and I've graded those and got those back to those folks who've turned it in. Any questions emerge, feel free to send me an email. I'll be checking my email all week, and we'll be happy to answer any more questions you may have. Okay. So for tonight, what we are going to do is we're going to focus on the impact of leadership on effectiveness. And then I'll do kind of a summation of what we've covered and talk about some of the necessary conditions for effectiveness in the public sector and in public organizations. But in the first half of class, our discussion of leadership, I took a look at your schedule of classes, and if it's still accurate, it looks like the next course you're going into is organizational leadership. I believe is your next course that's up with Dr. Golightly. So I thought what this would do tonight is kind of give you a little foreshadowing. I know we've talked about leadership before in the program, but reintroduce you to the concept of leadership with an eye on what it means for effectiveness. And then also cover some of the major models and theories in the leadership literature and what they mean for effectiveness as well. And so kind of get you hitting the ground running once you get to Stephen's class on organization leadership for your next course. Dr. Golightly is a great instructor. He was actually a student of mine a few years ago, and so I can attest to you'll have a very good experience in his class talking about organizational leadership. So let's talk about leadership briefly to start, and then we'll move into some of the models and some of the theories that have been developed over the years. I think we all have a decent idea of what we mean when we talk about the term leadership. And as we look at each one of these definitions of leadership, we're going to link them to concepts that we've talked about already in this course. So leadership can be defined in a lot of different ways. One way to define leadership is the ability to induce compliance. When leaders are inducing compliance on the part of their employees, you're really in that world of Chester Barnard and with organization theory, and you're really talking about this transactional type of relationship. That Barnard tells us that leaders provide incentives to their employees, and the purpose of those incentives is then to induce those employees to provide compliance and contributions to the organization to make the organization effective. Barnard told us that leaders have to get that compliance on the part of their employees, and effectiveness really is predicated upon compliance from employees. Leadership also speaks to the exercise of influence. And when we talk about exercising influence, we're really getting at the heart of the concept of power. Power is using resources to influence someone to do something they may not otherwise do. And so clearly with leadership, we're exercising power to exercise influence over others to shape their behavior. The ability to persuade. And some of you probably came out of an undergraduate background in political science. And there's a very famous political scientist named Richard Neustadt who talked a lot about the persuasive power of the presidency. And we really looked at the president as being the kind of the ultimate leadership position, and how presidents have a lot of limitations that are placed upon them in terms of separation of powers and federalism. And so what they need to do is to be successful, they need to have the power of persuasion. They need to be able to persuade people to take actions they otherwise would not do. I think that's true for public leaders as well in organizations, that we need to persuade because we have so many constraints and limitations placed upon our ability to order people to do things or to direct people to do things. We have a lot more constraints than perhaps our private sector counterparts, and so therefore we need to do a lot of persuasion. Leadership can be defined as the ability to achieve goals. And again, that's your goal attainment model of organizational effectiveness, one of those 4 models that we had discussed earlier in the class. And these definitions are obviously not mutually exclusive. There's really leadership as a combination of several, if not all, of those definitions. So by leadership, we're usually talking about the capacity of someone to direct others to achieve goals, energize and direct others to achieve goals. There is a difference in the literature that's drawn between leadership and management. And I know we oftentimes use the terms leadership and management interchangeably, but there is a distinction in the literature. And the primary distinction between leadership and management in the literature has to do with the allocation of resources. Managers on a daily basis are allocating resources to employees, to subordinates. And so the process of management is deciding how to allocate those resources, how many resources to allocate, and to whom should those resources be allocated. With leadership, sometimes leaders do allocate resources, but oftentimes they don't. And they don't have really the hands-on allocation of resource responsibility that managers oftentimes do. So with leaders, we're talking a little bit more about that 30,000 foot level, that kind of visionary type of approach, as opposed to the day-to-day allocation of resources like you would see with the term management. But we have a very healthy and a very robust set of literature and set of theories that help us understand leadership. And so I thought it'd be important for us to go through some of those theories again to kind of get you ready to go for your organization leadership class, and also to talk about what leadership really means for organizational effectiveness. Now, if we look back decades in the leadership literature, one of the earliest approaches to leadership was the trait model of leadership. And the trait model of leadership assumed that certain people were endowed with certain types of personality characteristics and that really made them good leaders. You know, things such as their intelligence, their foresight, personality characteristics such as enthusiasm, persistence, and dedication. But these were traits that we saw in most quote unquote good leaders. And some people were better endowed with those types of traits than other individuals. That can be somewhat problematic if we like to think about leadership as being something that can be taught. You know, obviously we're talking about leadership tonight. We're going through different leadership approaches. So clearly we assume that leadership can be taught and that there are certain skills and approaches that can be taught. That it's not just some people are born leaders and some people are not born to be leaders. So it's important that we've kind of moved away from this trait model of leadership and assume that we can teach leadership, and there are sets of skills and sets of characteristics that can be taught, that people can learn in order to become better leaders. There's no single characteristic that will distinguish someone from being a leader versus someone being a non-leader. So let's talk a little bit about where we have come from the trait-based approach to leadership and some of the theories that have grown out of this non-trait-based type of an approach. One of the oldest and most famous leadership studies, which you may have heard about already in the program, are the Ohio State studies. The Ohio State studies date back into the 1950s, and what the Ohio State scholars did is they used the leadership behavior questionnaire, and they used that questionnaire, sent it out to leaders to try and understand essentially what are these dimensions of leadership, and what do leaders focus on. And what they found is that there are two primary dimensions that came out of the Ohio State study that have been used throughout most of the more modern studies of leadership. Leaders can have a consideration for people. Leaders can also have a consideration for structure and task. By consideration for people, we're talking about leaders who are concerned about developing relationships. They're concerned about the well-being of their employees. They're concerned about having good, supportive working relationships with their subordinates. For consideration for structure and task, we're really talking about a focus on productivity. These are leaders who are much more focused on getting the job done, making the organization productive, as opposed to forming these tight relationships with their employees. So the Ohio State studies tell us here are two dimensions we can compare leaders on: consideration for people, relationships; consideration for structure and task, productivity. A few years after the Ohio State studies, as we like to say, when I was at Ohio State, that school up north, otherwise known as Michigan, did their own leadership studies and came up with similar types of conclusions. And for the school up north studies, they had consideration for people as one dimension, just like the Ohio State studies, and consideration for task as the other dimension, essentially productivity. So we have two different sets of studies being done, Ohio State and Michigan, that really form the basis for a lot of our understanding of leadership's theories that would come later on after the 50s and the 60s. Let's take a look at how these two dimensions we get from the Ohio State and the Michigan studies, how they compare to each other in terms of creating different categories of leaders. So in the Blick-Moulton grid that you see on the screen, you've got your y-axis and your x-axis. So on the y-axis, you have concern for people. As you move up, obviously more concern for people and relationships. On the x-axis, you have concern for production, task, getting the job done. As you move to the right, more concern for productivity. The worst situation to be in as a leader slash manager, and I told you, oftentimes use these terms interchangeably, is if you have a very low concern for people, low concern for production. This is what they refer to as impoverished management. Effective production is unattainable because people are lazy, apathetic, and indifferent. Sounds a lot like McGregor's Theory X type of modality. Sound and mature relationships are difficult to achieve because of human nature. Conflict is inevitable. So that impoverished management is where we don't want to be as managers or leaders. In the pink cell on the far right, you've got task management. These are your leaders or managers who are really concerned about productivity. People are a commodity, just like machines, kind of like the Frederick Taylor, cogs in the machinery. Manage responsibility to plan, direct, and control the work of those subordinate to them. Top left-hand corner, you have the green, the country club management. These people are high on concern for relationships, low on concern for productivity. Production is incidental to lack of conflict and good fellowship. That first you have to develop good relationships with yourself and your employees, as well as good relationships between your employees, which will create a lack of conflict, and that will then lead to productivity. But your number one focus is going to be on developing those good supportive relationships with your employees. At the top right, you have team management, high on concern for productivity, as well as high on concern for people. Production is from an integration of task and human requirements. So it's really this balance between going all out for production and also trying to develop these strong relationships with your employees. Then the yellow cell in the middle is a dampened pendulum. It's kind of that middle of the road. You push for production, you don't go all out. You push for good relationships, but you don't go all out. You kind of really try and balance the two. You're fair, yet you are firm as a leader or a manager. Where obviously we hope that we will be is in the team management part of the grid, where we're emphasizing both production as well as good supportive relationships with our employees. But again, you can see how this all builds out of those Ohio State and those Michigan studies and those two primary dimensions, concern for people versus concern for productivity. Another interesting theory that you will run into when you get into your next class is the LPC approach from Fiedler, Fiedler's contingency theory. And a lot of these leadership theories, as they have developed over the years, have been very much contingency-based types of theories, in that it really does depend upon the situation. It really does depend upon the subordinate that you are leading, the person that you are leading. And here in Fiedler's contingency theory, he provides for us this idea of, well, let's think about what we consider to be the least preferred coworker. That's what LPC stands for. Think of your least preferred coworker. When you think of your least preferred coworker, how would you rate the performance of that least preferred coworker? You know, the least preferred person to work with. Some leaders and managers will provide even those LPC employees, those least preferred coworkers, with relatively high ratings. Those high LPC types of leaders are your people-oriented, your relationship-oriented types of leaders. They're more concerned about a good relationship than perhaps being concerned about productivity. Those leaders or managers who provide that LPC with a very low rating, those are your low LPC types of leaders. They're very task-oriented, again, falling in line with the Ohio State and the Michigan studies. So are you a high LPC leader? Are you a low LPC leader? Are you relationship-oriented, or are you task-oriented? The approach that works better, either low LPC or a high LPC, will depend upon a variety of different characteristics. One thing you'll want to consider is how favorable or unfavorable the work setting is. So if it's a very favorable or very unfavorable setting, it's a very clear-cut type of situation, that's when we see more of the low LPC approach to leadership. But that's usually not where we're at in our organizations. We're usually not at the extreme polar opposites. We're usually in the intermediate situations where, you know, some things are good, some things are bad, there are some challenges, there are also some opportunities. In those intermediate situations where it's not really bad or really good, but that's where the high LPC, the relationship-oriented approach, tends to work better than a more task-oriented type of approach. And for that reason, that's why the literature shows us that high LPC approaches tend to be more effective than low LPC, because our organizations are usually in that kind of gray area, that intermediate area between things being really good, things being really bad. There are contingencies that we also have to consider beyond just, the favorability or unfavorability of the setting, that can also lead us to which of these high LPC or LPC approaches, low LPC approaches, work best in those situations. So Fiedler will tell us one thing we need to look at is we need to look at leader-member relations. We need to look at the relationships between leaders and their subordinates, and how strong those relationships are, how much trust there is in those relationships in terms of using a high LPC or a low LPC approach. Clearly, if you've got a lot of trust in those leader-member relationships, those dyadic relationships, then you're probably going to be able to be more high LPC. You're going to want to be more relationship oriented than if there's a lack of trust between the leader and the subordinate. The task structure is another important consideration. How clear is the task? Is this a task that needs to be explained? You need a whole lot of direction, a whole lot of instruction, or is this a task that's pretty straightforward that your employee already knows how to do and they don't need a whole lot of that direction? How much power does the leader have? How much formal power do they have in their office? If they have a lot of formal power in their office, it can kind of cut both ways. If they have a lot of power in their office, a lot of that formal authority, they're going to have the authority to back up a task-oriented type of an approach. If not, then they're going to have to really persuade, and they're really going to have to work on those relationships with their employees. It's a great question from Diana in Texia. Has a hybrid shown any success? So you have to select one. It's a great question. You do not have to select one, and you probably shouldn't be selecting one. It's very much what Mary Parker Fowler tells us is situational leadership. We oftentimes lead by the situation. So sometimes we'll depend upon the employee we're dealing with, and our a priori relationship with that employee may have to deal with the structure of the task and how clear or difficult the task is, how much power we have and political capital we have. So depending upon the situation itself, you could be more or less high LPC depending upon that situation. And I think what I really like about that contingency approach to leadership is it's kind of a microcosm of everything that we have seen in the development of organization theory literature and public administration literature over the past 150 years. Is that, again, we are moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach, and we're moving more to a recognition of it depends. Well, it's my favorite answer in every class. It really depends upon the situation. It really depends upon the contingency. And that's a theme that we are going to see as we talk about things like, leader-member exchanges, as we talk about social exchange theory, as we talk about all these theories we'll talk about over the next few minutes. That's kind of the theme that ties them all together. That it really depends upon the situation and the characteristics of the situation. There's no one best way to lead in every single situation. Another theory that got a lot of traction in the literature is what's called path goal theory. Path goal theory says that it's the job of the leader to motivate their employees by making clear the path between where the employee is now and the achievement of the employee's goals. So you motivate your followers by identifying the best, most appropriate path for them to pursue to achieve their goals. And by clearing obstacles in that path toward achieving their goals, that's how you lead your employees effectively. It is really very much linked to Vroom's expectancy theory that we talked about when we talked about motivation. Remember, in Vroom's expectancy theory, you have these three characteristics of valences, instrumentalities, and expectancies. Well, under path goal theory, what we're doing is leaders are manipulating those valences, those instrumentalities, and those expectancies in order to motivate and lead their employees. So the way in which they're going to do that is that they will understand their individual employees. They'll know what those individual employees value and the types of incentives that they value, those being their valences. They will also make a strong commitment to carrying through on their promises, instrumentality, and then they will also strive to learn the confidence of their employees in their own abilities, which is expectancies. And so what the leader can do is manipulate those balances, instrumentalities, and expectancies in order to motivate their employees, in order to shape the behavior and persuade and influence the behavior of their employees to, again, then make the organization more effective. So when you're talking path goal theory and this whole idea of leaders clearing the path between the employee and the goals that they want to achieve, that theory really tells us that there are basically 4 behavioral styles that enable leaders to manipulate balances, instrumentalities, and expectancies. And the 4 different styles that grow out of this path goal theory are the directive, supportive, participative, and achievement-oriented types of styles. The directive style is just what it sounds like. It's kind of a classical type of approach where you very much direct the activities of your employees. A directive approach where you tell your employees what to do and how to do it works well if you have very unclear tasks, because those employees need that guidance. They want that guidance. And so they don't know how to achieve their goal unless they get the guidance of how to do it. But if your tasks are very clear and employees know what they are doing, then it's viewed as being micromanagement. So the directive approach works well if tasks are unclear, but it will hurt effectiveness if the tasks are very clear and well understood. The supportive style that also grows out of the path goal theory, you provide that support to your employees, understanding the challenges that they have, helping them work through those challenges. The supportive approach is obviously good if tasks are very difficult and frustrating. The more difficult the task, the more difficult the goal, the more potential for frustration on the part of the subordinate. So therefore, you provide this support to help them deal with those frustrations. That then motivates them to be more effective. The participative approach, you involve people in decision-making, you involve them in their own self-determination and self-governance. That's very good if tasks are vague and for employees who value self-esteem. So employees who have a high value on self-esteem, a la the Maslow hierarchy of needs, by allowing them to participate, allowing them to self-determine and self-govern, that will be a motivator for those employees. Again, that's an effective leadership style in that situation. And then the 4th approach is the achievement-oriented approach. We have some employees who are really striving for, as Maslow called, self-actualization. They don't have those deficiencies left in those deficiency types of needs. They're motivated by a growth need. They're motivated by that self-actualization. They're motivated by Chris Argyris's personal growth type of maturation process. So therefore, you help them achieve that self-actualization. Their goal is self-actualization. You remove the obstacles and you provide them what they need in order to try and self-actualize. We do have to recognize that not all of our employees are like that. You know, some employees are more theory Y than they are theory X. Some are more theory X than they are theory Y. Again, there's a lot of self-selection in terms of who's trying to self-actualize, who is theory Y, and you then lead according to whether they're theory X, theory Y, you lead according to that self-selection. So I like path goal theory because it is so closely tied to Vroom's expectancy theory. It really gives us kind of this polemic for leaders to understand how they can manipulate the characteristics of Vroom's expectancy theory in order to remove the obstacles to allow employees to see how they can better achieve their individual goals. Then you have that goal congruence between individual and organizational goals, which then makes the organization more effective. We'd already mentioned Chris Argyris, and so another theory that we like to look at in the leadership literature is the life cycle model of Hersey and Blanchard. The life cycle model is very closely aligned with Chris Argyris and his personal growth theory. Chris Argyris tells us that people go through a process of maturation. As they go through their maturation process, they will develop deepening interests. They will develop a longer term type of time perspective. They will become more concerned about society and what they are giving back to society and those around them. They're more likely to become mentors. That's that maturation, personal growth type of process. So it's then incumbent in the life cycle model to understand where your employees are in terms of their personal growth maturation trajectory. So you need to know your individual employees, their level of emotional maturity, their amount of experience, and then lead them according to where they are in this personal growth type of trajectory. This takes us right back to those two dimensions of the task orientation and relationship orientation. The farther someone is down the road in their maturation process, more likely it is that you can focus more on relationships than you have to focus on tasks. They're emotionally mature, they know where they're going, they know what their goals are, so you don't have to necessarily direct them in what they need to do. Employees that don't have the same level of emotional maturity, who are not quite as far through their personal growth process, they may need to be told what to do more. They may need to have a more of what we call a telling type of approach, more of a directive type of approach to how you lead those individuals. So from this life cycle approach, we end up with 4 different types of styles that come out of this approach as well: telling, selling, participating, and delegating, all depending upon where the employee is in their personal growth trajectory. So they're very early in their trajectory, they don't have a lot of emotional maturity, then you're in the telling type of style, where again, you're directing what they are doing. If they've moved a little bit further down the road in terms of emotional maturity, then you can move from telling to selling, where you are convincing them that yes, this is the appropriate thing to do. This kind of moves us, if you will, from a Max Weber and a Frederick Taylor in the telling approach, more to Chester Barnard in terms of his need for compliance. You need to sell to them that this is what they need to do, and you sell it by providing them with their incentives and their inducements. If they're further down the road in emotional maturity and personal growth, then you can move to participating. Participating, you allow them to participate in their own self-governance. You allow them to participate in decision-making that appeals to their self-esteem needs. Obviously, those people who are further along in their personal growth, that will be something that will certainly motivate those employees. For those employees who are very far along their development of personal growth, that's where you can move into delegating. And delegating, you trust those employees to have the skills and to have the motivation in order to get the job done. And so you can delegate a lot of those tasks to your subordinates. So again, whether you're telling, selling, participating, or delegating will depend upon where those employees are in that life cycle, where they are in their arduous personal growth type of development. But again, here we're talking about a situational contingency-based approach to leadership. It depends upon your employees and where they are in their personal growth journey. Sometimes leadership also depends upon the relationship that leaders have with their subordinates. If subordinates have a good performance record and that leaders know that they've performed well in the past, if something goes wrong, and there is some incident of poor performance, it's much more likely that the leader will cut them a break. And they'll say, well, it's not the employee's fault that this has gone wrong, it's the situation. This is a unique situation. It's the situation that led to the poor performance as opposed to the individual employee themselves. However, if an employee has a poor performance record, leaders are much more likely to blame the employee than blame the situation. This is what's known as attribution theory. So you will attribute performance to either the person or the situation, depending upon the past track record that you have experienced with that individual employee. Again, it's contingency based. It depends upon the employee. It depends upon the employee's previous performance and how much trust you have in that employee. Speaking of trust, that leads us to another leadership theory that you'll cover in your next class, leader-member exchange theory. And again, leader-member exchange theory really speaks to the contingency nature of different leadership approaches. In the leader-member exchange approach, we assume that every leader will develop a unique relationship with each individual employee. This unique relationship is what's referred to as a dyadic relationship. So you'll develop a dyadic relationship, and a different dyadic relationship with each one of your employees. And in terms of the best practice, again, the answer is it depends. It depends upon the situation in which you find yourself. It depends upon, again, the personal growth of the employee that you're dealing with. It depends upon how clear the tasks are. It depends upon how much formal authority you have. These are all contingencies you need to take into account to determine which is the most appropriate way of leading this person in this organization in this particular moment. It's like we always say about public administration, that public administration is both timeless as well as time-bound, and that there are some maxims of dealing with human beings in the public sector that tend to remain true regardless of what period of time we're talking about, but it is also time-bound in that how you approach leading your organization and leading individual employees depends upon the situation you find yourself in at that current point in time. So you're going to develop these dyadic relationships, these individual dyads with each member of your organization. The dyadic relationship that you develop with your employees will depend upon whether or not you have a good trusting relationship or not. If you have a good trusting relationship with an employee, then your dyad will be a high exchange type of relationship, a high exchange dyad where there's a lot of communication, there's a lot of openness, a lot of sharing of information. If you have employees who you do not trust, then it will be a low exchange dyadic relationship, meaning that you won't have the same exchange of information. You won't have the same type of relationship you would have with someone that you trust. So again, the dyadic relationship you have with each individual employee will depend upon that employee. And whether it's a high exchange or a low exchange relationship is all predicated upon the amount of trust you have in that person and the amount of trust that person then has in you as a leader. But again, the important thing is it's contingency based. Every dyadic relationship is going to look different for different types of employees. Another approach that we've seen come out of the leadership literature is kind of predicated on the operant conditioning approach that we talked about when we talked about motivation last week. We said with operant conditioning, that approach said that people will respond to different types of stimuli. And so you can shape behavior with using different types of stimuli, and different stimuli used will result in different types of behaviors. So that's that operant conditioning type of an approach. We in leadership theory take operant conditioning and we kind of transform it into what we call social exchange theory. And in social exchange theory, we look at how people interact in a cognitive, behavioral, and environmental way, meaning that how people behave will really be determined by these reciprocal interactions that they have with fellow employees, with the external environment, with leaders. And all these exchanges that we have will then develop these behavioral patterns and will then dictate how people behave. So the assumption here is that leaders can do specific things to shape these social exchanges in order to therefore shape the behaviors of their followers and their employees. It's kind of similar to what we had talked about last week with social learning theory. You know, people learn from role modeling. They learn through living vicariously through other people. They learn through watching other people. Those are all exchanges that will help shape the behavior of those employees. So as a leader, there are different ways in which you can shape those exchanges to have an impact upon employee behavior. Using feed-forward techniques to anticipate problems and avoid them, meaning that you have the foresight, or you're exercising the foresight to see problems before they actually occur, or see problems when they are minor before they become major problems. enhancing employee acceptance of goals by involving them in goal development. So again, as Martha Durthick always tells us, in order to implement something, we have to have the support of our implementers. If our implementers do not support what's being implemented, they will use everything they can in order to try and stop or delay that implementation. So if we include people in the development of goals, they're more likely to work hard toward the achievement of those goals. Emphasize self-management so that people learn how to manage themselves and people learn how to self-govern and how to self-direct. Recognize how the environment influences behavior. Understand the exchange between the environment and the individual employee. And employees are going to react differently to different types of external as well as internal environments. Employing goal setting, rehearsal on the part of your employees. We talked about last week, that mental rehearsal, self-instruction. Those are all strategies that leaders can use to manage the way in which individuals interact with their environments, to manage these social exchanges in order to make their employees more effective and to motivate their employees. But again, this is just, these are some strategies that you can use. The strategies you will use will again depend upon the situation, because every social exchange is going to be different. Every organization is going to have a different external environment and a different internal environment, a different organization culture. Another theory that comes out of the leadership literature that you will cover in your next class is what's called cognitive resource utilization theory. That's a nice fancy name that basically just means that people, when they react to a situation, can rely upon either their level of intelligence or their level of experience. Essentially, if you're dealing with a very low stress type of situation, where you have time to think about solutions to problems, you have time to react to problems and challenges, intelligence is oftentimes more important than experience. And that's the cognitive resource that people tend to use. They use their intelligence in low stress situations. By contrast, in a very high stress situation, where there are time challenges, time crunches, and these types of challenges have to be dealt with very, very quickly, that's when the cognitive resource you rely upon tends to be your experience. So what this suggests to leaders, this cognitive resource utilization theory, is it depends again. It depends upon the situation and how quickly a decision has to be made, the balance of that decision, how important that decision is, the amount of stress involved in making that decision. If it's a very high stress type of situation, that's something your well-experienced employees will probably react better to. If it's a lower stress situation, then people are going to rely more upon their intelligence because they have more time to think through all these different types of alternatives. So again, it depends upon the stress level of the situation, whether people tend to rely upon their intelligence or whether they rely upon their experience. And so as a leader, it kind of tells you which people are going to be the people to put in those positions in those types of situations. So it depends upon the stressfulness, if you will, of the situation. So a lot of different theories, and again, that's just the very tip of the iceberg in terms of leadership theories, but just kind of foreshadow some of the theories that you're going to talk about in your next course. Those are some of the major theories that have emerged from the leadership literature. But when you look at those theories and you kind of distill them down, what you end up with is you end up with three primary leadership styles that have been recommended by the literature over the years. And these are styles that you're probably very familiar with: transactional leadership, transformational leadership, and charismatic leadership. So when we look at these three different styles of leadership, the different authors have different things to say about these styles of leadership. So Burns, for example, distinguishes between transactional and transformational leadership, as transactional leaders will motivate their followers by recognizing their needs and providing rewards in exchange for their performance. Transactional, Chester Barnard, inducements for compliance and contribution. Sometimes these leaders are what are referred to as brokers. So they will broker these deals with their followers. I give you this, you then give me this contribution, kind of that quid pro quo type of relationship. Burns then says you can contrast that with transformational leaders. Transformational leaders are not controlling. Transformational leaders try and help their employees self-actualize, and they try and raise their followers' goals to a higher plane. And they also have a talent for coupling vision of success to empowerment and motivation. They bring a vision. These are kind of your visionary leaders. They bring a vision into the organization, and then they're very skilled at getting people to work toward that vision. And that working toward that vision will then help those employees self-actualize and help those employees grow. So we've all worked with some transactional leaders, and we've all worked with some transformational leaders. Whereas transactional leaders tend to be referred to as the brokers, transformational leaders tend to be referred to as the entrepreneurs. They're the ones who bring a vision into the organization, and they then have a skill for getting people to work toward the accomplishment of that vision. But again, it's situational, and we know that it's not an either-or type of situation. And we understand that effective leaders are the ones who are able to combine a transactional and a transformational approach. So again, if you are dealing with in a low exchange type of dyadic relationship with an employee, you're probably going to be more transactional. If you're dealing with an employee who is at an early part of their life cycle, an early part of their personal growth journey, you're probably going to be more transactional. I don't know why it says transactional. If you are dealing with someone who is farther along in their personal growth, you can be more transformational. If you have the political resources and capital to bring your vision into the organization and make it a reality, you can be more transformational. So sometimes we're transactional, sometimes we're transformational. We lead according to the situation, like Mary Parker Follett tells us. Bass gives us another way of looking at transformational and transactional leaders. They're very similar to what Burns told us. For transactional leaders, it's based upon contingency-based rewards. Again, these transactions. For transformational leaders, they have idealized influence that they exert over their employees. They stimulate their employees intellectually. They understand their employees are individuals, and they look to try and help those individual employees achieve their individual goals. These are the types of leaders that we oftentimes refer to as being inspirational. You know, they inspire their followers, and by inspiring their followers, they motivate them to be more productive and more effective. But again, being transformational means that you have to have the resources in order to do that. So if you come into an organization and you don't have a whole lot of support when you come into that organization, it's going to be very tough for you to be transformational. And just something we're seeing recently is Ben Sass is talking about leaving the Senate to go and become the chancellor of the University of Florida system. And he's been met with a lot of resistance. And there are students, thousands of students out protesting him becoming the president of the university. It's going to be tough to be transformational when you have that much opposition as you come into the organization as a new leader. It takes away a lot of that political capital, takes away a lot of those resources. And then there's charismatic leadership. And I'm sure we've all worked with charismatic leaders before. Typically, charismatic leaders lead on the basis of their personality, the basis of obviously their charisma. The nice thing about charismatic leadership is that charismatic leadership engenders a lot of loyalty among followers. And so followers tend to be much more loyal to charismatic leaders than they would be to a transactional type of a leader. The disadvantage of charismatic leadership is that oftentimes the power, the resources for a charismatic leader are embodied within the leader themselves rather than being embodied within the office. So when the authority is within the leader themselves as opposed to being in the office, whenever that leader leaves the organization, they will take their power resources with them when they leave. If the power resources are embodied within the office, then it really doesn't matter. That authority is going to stay there regardless of who the incumbent in that office is. So in charismatic leadership, there are two different strains of charismatic leadership theory. there is the attribution strain and the self-concept strain. In the attribution approach to charismatic leadership, followers identify with leaders because of what they stand for, and they like what they see in those leaders. And so you'll follow someone if that leader, for example, advocates a vision that's highly different from the status quo. So a leader who is willing to buck the past, and a leader who is willing to do things differently and have the courage to do things differently, some people will then follow them based upon that. They really, they feel that's a strong characteristic. And so they follow them based upon that characteristic. They oftentimes will follow leaders who act in unconventional ways. And so not just the same old, but they're willing to try new things, be innovative and creative. They follow leaders who demonstrate self-sacrifice, who are willing to sacrifice of themselves. And so, if you've got a budget cut coming, and if you're going to have to ask employees to take a cut in their pay, hopefully that leader is willing to take a cut in their pay as well, and a larger percentage cut than what employees are taking. They follow leaders who have confidence, who are confident in their abilities and demonstrate that confidence. And they follow leaders who are able to use persuasive appeals as opposed to merely using power and authority. So in the attribution theory, people follow leaders who exhibit characteristics that they value and characteristics that they hold in high regard. In the self-concept theory, people will follow leaders who they really identify with. And so if they personally identify with this person, they will follow that person. If they internalize the beliefs of that leader, they will follow that person. But again, if they would kind of see themselves in that person, that's the self-concept theory. That's what's going to make someone follow a charismatic leader. So sometimes they follow because of attribution theory. They see these characteristics they value. Sometimes they follow leaders because they see themselves in that leader, as we see in self-concept type of theory. We know leaders can be most effective when they're able to actually impact the organization culture. And we spent some time talking about organization culture a few weeks ago. And organization culture really is what gives us the uniqueness of organizations. And this is really what suggests to us that how you lead an organization will depend upon that unique organization. We identified organization culture as being the norms and the values and the expectations that people hold within that organization. So some leaders are able to lead effectively by modifying that culture, or sometimes bringing a brand new culture into an organization. So remember, we talked about organization culture. I introduced you to Sheen and his approach to organization culture. And we said that when we study organization cultures, we study them similar to how we would study an ancient society. In that, just like with the ancient society, organizations create things like artifacts, they have espoused values, and then they also have basic underlying assumptions. We know that artifacts are at the surface level. So we identified artifacts as being things like agendas, meeting minutes from meetings, being policy and procedure manuals. Those are the artifacts that are created on a daily basis. It's a very shallow way of measuring the organization's culture. We said at a deeper level, organizations have these espoused values. Those are going to be like their mission statement, their code of ethics, statement of their goals and objectives. They're telling you what they value as an organization. What's the most difficult thing to study in organization culture are the basic underlying assumptions. These are the things, the expectations that people have of how we should behave, but they don't really talk about them. They're not written down, they're not really talked about. It's just everyone shares those same types of basic assumptions and basic expectations. That's the very deep level of organization culture that's much more invisible and much more difficult to measure. Well, so what? What does that then mean for our discussion of leadership? What it means is that when leaders come into an organization, they have the ability to embed culture into that organization. And by embedding culture in that organization, you truly are being a transformational type of leader. The types of symbols that are used can communicate culture to the members of the organization. The types of language that's used in terms of jargon and slogans, those communicate culture as well. Leaders can communicate culture with stories and narratives, urban legends and sagas and myths about, this happened in the past in the organization. That can help convey culture. Culture can also be conveyed through practices and events. And so when you have special events or repeated events, so if you have employee of the week types of events or luncheons and things like that, that will then show employees what is valued in the organization. That will then communicate culture. So transformational leaders who really do want to embed a culture into their organization or reinforce an existing culture can do it in a variety of different ways. They can make it clear what the leader monitors, ignores, measures, and controls. Again, this is kind of that role modeling type of social learning, social exchange theory. How they react to critical incidents and crises will send messages to employees about what is valued in that organization. Role modeling, teaching, coaching, and mentoring, establishing criteria for advancement and punishment so people know why they're being advanced, why they're being punished, coordinating organizational design and structure with those cultural messages. And so if your cultural message is an egalitarian message in that we're all in this together and we're all colleagues and we're all co-equal, but then you're doing that in a tall hierarchical structure, you're not coordinating your organizational design with your cultural message. You'll probably want to change your structure to be a flatter type of hierarchical structure. Coordinating your procedures with your cultural messages. Again, the cultural message is that we trust you as employees, we believe in you, we believe you should have self-determination, but then we have procedures that don't allow those employees to make decisions, you're going to have that disconnect. Designing physical space to communicate culture. This is one that's oftentimes undervalued, but one that I think is really important. How you design the physical space will have an impact upon culture. And I think we've learned that through the pandemic and all the remote work arrangements and the impact that those remote work arrangements have had on the cultures of organizations. And from a sociological perspective, we look at public housing projects, like the classic example is the Pruitt-Igoe public housing project. And the Pruitt-Igoe public housing project, the apartment building was not built in a very user-friendly way, in that you had elevators that did not stop at every floor. So, to save money, they would stop at, you would have some elevators only stop at even floors. And so if you lived on an odd floor, you'd either have to take the elevator up a level and go down, or take the elevator to a level below and walk up the steps. A lot of things were designed to not be very user-friendly. And that then made people not like where they were living, not respect where they were living, and it fell into disrepair. Oftentimes within an organization, we use physical space. And so in my school district, decided that up on the second floor of the office, we had the finance department. And no one really interacted much with the finance department, and members of the finance department really didn't interact much with each other either. And so rather than having cubicles and individual offices, they redesigned the space to be a much more open, much more collaborative type of space. And that had an impact upon the culture of the finance department. Employing stories about events and people can communicate culture as well and embed culture. The formal statements of organizational philosophy can embed culture. And approaching cultural leadership as comprehensive organizational change can embed that new culture into the organization. So the moral here from a leadership effectiveness type of perspective is that transformational leaders, when they are able to embed new cultures into the organization and have employees accept those new cultures, they are truly transforming the organization. They are truly being effective at transforming the organization, throwing out the status quo, and getting employee support for new ways of doing the business of the organization, new ways of achieving organizational goals and objectives. So good transformational leaders are able to modify that organization culture in effective ways. We hope that our leaders and managers will be entrepreneurial types of leaders. Not all of them are. So to determine if a leader is going to be an entrepreneurial type of leader, we can look at the skill of that leader and compare it to that leader's commitment to the program or organization's goals. If you have a leader who doesn't have a lot of skills and is not terribly committed to the goals of the program or the organization, those are the leaders that are usually considered to be administrative survivors. You know, they're just there to try and survive on a daily basis. They're not looking to make any major changes. They're collecting their paycheck. They're trying to keep the trains running on time. That's essentially it. But they really can't do a good job of making the trains run on time because they don't really have the skills to be able to do it. If they do have the skills, but they are not terribly committed to the program or the organization's goals, they usually fall into the generalist category. So, you know, they're getting the job done, but they're not really transforming the organization. They're not really moving the organization forward. They're just kind of checking off the boxes on a daily basis. If you have a leader who's very committed to program or organizational goals, but they are low on the skill level, those are what Anthony Downs refers to as the zealots in his Bureau ideologies. And so this would be your zealot type of person. The ideal situation, the entrepreneurial box to be in, those leaders obviously who are committed to the goals of the program, the organization, and have the skills to achieve those goals, those are your more entrepreneurial leaders. How you become an entrepreneurial leader, though, the literature tells us, will depend upon how you manage the situation. Different situations will call for different leadership styles, and hopefully you have the skills to implement those different leadership styles in those different types of situations. We have a lot more that we could cover with leadership, but knowing that you're moving into the leadership class next, I don't think we need to go through all of these slides and talk about all these things in depth, but just to cover them very, very briefly. Effective leaders also need to be able to effectively manage groups. As Elton Mayo tells us, organizations naturally have groups that form. Some groups are formal groups, some groups are informal groups. But that social aspect of having humans exchanging with each other, interacting with each other, means that groups are going to form. So leaders must be effective at leading and managing those groups. They have to understand why groups form. They have to understand how those groups impact the organization and what they can do to lead and manage those groups in a productive way. Groups can be positive and they can be negative. Some of the positives of groups is that groups can outperform individuals, as Elton Mayo showed us in the Hawthorne experiment. We know that group dynamics can motivate individuals, especially underperforming individuals. We know that through Mary Parker Follett's integration and interpenetration of ideas, the interaction of people together in groups can foster knowledge and foster creativity. But we also know there are negatives. Groups can stifle individual opinions when we get into a phenomenon such as groupthink. We know that groups can encourage the quote unquote wrong culture, that groups of people can get together and really stymie the ability of the leader to embed a culture into the organization. And we know the larger the group is, the more likely there will be free riders. There will be those rational, self-interested actors who try and maximize their benefits while minimizing their costs by not contributing to the organization and just deriving the benefits from the work of the groups that they belong to. But research does show us that effective leaders can have a good, strong impact on group behavior. And one of the best things they can do in terms of managing group behavior is to help the organization avoid this phenomenon known as groupthink. You've probably run into groupthink before in some previous classes. But in groupthink, what happens is you have a group of individuals who stifle creativity. They try and minimize conflict and reach consensus without evaluating different ideas. They shut down other ideas and focus only on the ideas that they share as a group. It really cuts out independent thinking. It's very much of a decision-making shortcut. So effective leaders are able to manage and eliminate groupthink. They encourage people to be critical evaluators. They have more than 2 or more groups that come to decisions independently, so you can compare how those groups came to those decisions. They require consultation with people outside of the groups. They accept criticism of their own actions. They break groups into subgroups, use outside experts and consultants, have people play devil's advocate. A lot of strategies that leaders can do to try and manage groups to avoid groupthink and make sure that groups are actually having a positive impact upon the organization. Effective leaders not only manage groups effectively, but effective leaders also manage communication effectively. They understand how information is passed in the organization. They understand how the processing of communication affects outcomes in the organization. They know who has direct access to information, and they understand the roles that different members play in the transmission of communication. You've probably seen in your own organization, so I don't think you have to go through every one of these bullet points, but we know that there are a lot of distortions and a lot of problems that occur within organizations dealing with communication. Some of the barriers to effective communication: when you don't have feedback. This is especially true when you're communicating in the performance evaluation process. When there's noise in communication, so there's just so much going on that the message is not getting through. Misuse and misunderstanding of language. Again, this is why sometimes emails can be problematic, because people read emails with a tone that may not actually be there. There are sometimes listening deficiencies where people just don't want to listen to other opinions outside of their own. We know groups can have difficulty engaging and communicating with each other. We also know that there are distortions in communication in organizations, distorted perceptions, bad translation, errors of abstraction and differentiation, where we make things too abstract and too conceptual in nature. And you can go on and read all the other bullet points, but there are a lot of problems that leaders need to deal with in their organizations. To be an effective leader, obviously, you need to understand how your organization is communicating both vertically as well as horizontally, and then hopefully employ some of Mary Parker Follett's integration theories in terms of managing that communication. But when you do have a lot of communication in your organization, that oftentimes is going to lead inevitably to conflict. We know that conflict will occur in organizations, and so effective managers are able to effectively control that conflict and make that conflict productive as opposed to unproductive for the organization. We know that conflict can come from abstract goals, unclear goals. We know that it can come from different vested interests. So there are a lot of ways in which conflict will be generated within an organization. But organizations are social environments. And as social environments, conflict is an inevitable part of every organization, especially a democratic organization like what Mary Parker Follett talks to us about. Charlie, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm having problems with my camera. So I just wanted to touch base on the slide that you went over, the last slide in regards to communications problems and distortions. And I guess for me, coming from the private sector with a communications degree, what I'm adapting to, which has been very challenging, has been getting buy-in, getting support, and in particular in regards to developing a communications plan, because that is my background. And what I'm saying is basically like having a consistent message, one voice for the organization, not having mixed messages, and it goes everywhere from branding all the way to the development of promotional material for the city. But what I have noticed is that people, especially in at least this is my first like public sector job, people are very much attached to what they know and are fearful of change. And what's happened is it's either like you have to introduce it slowly in bite sizes, or you have to just kind of rip the bandage off and just make it happen. And, obviously the challenge is once I develop, let's say, a communications plan, marketing plan, a rebranding plan for the city, the ideas may be great, right? But at the end of the day, if the directors of the different divisions do not support the idea, their employees will not support the idea. And so it's important to get collaboration and buy-in. And that's been one of the main challenges that I've had here at this organization, is that things are done without any form of communication. And then you have things like the wrong city emblem, like sketched on a piece of glass for the sliding glass door that now has to be redone. You know, and it's things like that that become so frustrating that sometimes I'm just banging my head against the wall. But I'm glad that you're going over these things, because I honestly thought that I was losing my mind, and maybe I was just unique in that this is just happening here. But, you know, with the fact that so many baby boomers are going to be exiting the public sector, and we need so much more new talent to come in to be innovative and to have that vision. It's a struggle, and it's a struggle that I have to remind myself every day it's worth undertaking, because I do believe and I have a passion for some of my goals. But buy-in is not as easy as it makes sense, because for somebody that's worked in the public sector for a long time and that's seen things in a certain way with a certain view and lens, it's very difficult to adapt to somebody else coming in, looking at it from a completely different perspective, and possibly seeing areas for improvement.
Right. Yeah, I think you make a number of really great points there, and you're right. It's difficult to do things that are what we call discrepant with the status quo, because there's resistance on both the part of employees as well as leaders. So as an employee, if someone leader comes in and wants you to do things differently than what's been done before, you've got some, from an economic perspective, we call them sunk costs. So you've got some sunk costs already in terms of how you have been doing it so far. It's going to cost you time, it's going to cost you thought, it's going to cost you resources in order to make this change. So there's resistance on the part of the employee. There's also sometimes resistance on the part of the manager as well, the leader as well, because again, information is power. And so by delegating, providing information, providing those types of resources to employees, there's the concern on the part of the leader that they're giving up power, they're giving up some of their resources. So you're right, you need to get buy-in on the part of the implementers, which means they need to be involved at the very early stage of these decisions and these changes. But to involve them at these early stages, you're going to have to give up some power and some resources. And that's something that's hard for public leaders and managers to do, because they already have so many other constraints on their power and authority to begin with. You know, they've got all these constraints from the career civil service system. They have all these constraints from the collective bargaining agreement. They've got all these limitations already that if they give up information, if they give up a lot of decision-making authority, they see that as a lot of their power, remaining power, also going out the door. And so when you have resistance on the part of both leaders as well as employees, it makes it difficult to have these whole-scale changes to the way in which the organization does things. It's really easy for organizations to say, well, this is the way we've always done it, and that's why we're doing this again in the future. That's probably the worst reason to give for doing something in the future, is that that's how we've done it in the past. Yeah.
And I hear it all the time. It's like, well, clearly, maybe it's time to try something different.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And so we do end up with a lot of these distortions in communication. We end up with not everyone being on the same page, and it's a problem that's not unique to the public sector, but I do think it's a problem that is certainly magnified in the public sector. And so for folks like you and others who've gone from the private sector into the public sector, I think you really see those differences as really glaring differences, much more so than folks who've always been in the public sector. Again, there are problems for both sectors, but I really think, as you're pointing out, they're really magnified once you get into public organizations, because of a lot of those limitations and constraints on what leaders can and cannot do. So I think those are excellent points. And communication is always difficult for leaders to manage. But when we do that communication, we're trying to get more vertical and horizontal communication in our organization. That's going to cause conflict. I mean, when you have people with different ideas and different perspectives, you're going to end up with a lot more conflict. And as you mentioned, Charlie, you have people, baby boomers, who are leaving, and you have more younger employees and Gen Z employees, or whatever the phrase is now, from younger folks, I guess I'll say as an old guy. Whenever you have more people coming in from younger generations, again, you've got more potential for that conflict. because you have people from multiple generations in that organization. So it then becomes important for leaders to be able to manage that conflict. Conflict can be very bad for an organization, but we know that it can also be managed productively. If we do a good job of managing conflict, we can make conflict productive for that organization. So what's important for leaders is to be able to identify conflict early and to intervene in that conflict before it has a lasting impact upon the organization. And I'll say, and Charlie says, if there is ego when you have a new leader comes in with innovative ideas, employees with more tenure feel threatened. Absolutely. You know, especially if you got someone who's been in the organization for many years, you have a brand new leader comes in with completely different ideas than what the organization's done in the past, that you've got a lot of conflict there. And I see that a lot, you know, in the academic world, when you have more, we'll say, veteran instructors who have tenure, who have been teaching their courses the same way and doing their research in the same way for many years. And then you have a associate dean or a dean who comes in, or a department chair who comes in, wants to do things differently. That tends to be where most of the resistance is coming up from, the more veteran tenure types of faculty members. Heather says, is there any compelling reason for them to follow you? Do you have any leverage? Yeah, that's what we're talking about with political capital. You know, that's what we're talking about, those types of resources that you bring in terms of bringing support in with you. Sometimes if you come into an organization that's been very dysfunctional in the past and they've been very unhappy with leadership, sometimes fresh leadership is something you'll kind of have a honeymoon period when you come in, and that they're just happy to have somebody else in that position. And so you have to then use those resources you get from that honeymoon period as judiciously as you can to then try and embed that new culture into the organization. So sometimes you can benefit from that. Sometimes new leaders come into a situation where there is a beloved leader who's been there for many years and retired. That's going to be a much more difficult situation. You know, I know at Long Beach, we had when I first went into Long Beach 20 some years ago, we had a president who had been there for over a decade. Everyone loved him. He used to walk around campus and, you know, shake hands with people and, you know, have lunch with students, and everyone referred to him as Uncle Bob, and everyone loved him. And when he retired and a new younger president came in, he had a whole lot of trouble because he was not Uncle Bob, and he had a completely different personality. He was a micromanager and just didn't have any honeymoon period whatsoever and had zero political capital. And so it really depends upon the relationship that former leader had with the organization members. But if you can identify conflict at its different stages and address that conflict before it really manifests itself, that's how you manage conflict as a leader. So there are several different stages of conflict that leaders need to be able to identify. There's latent conflict. Latent conflict is when conflict hasn't happened yet, but the stage has been set for it. And so it has potential to happen, but it hasn't really manifested itself yet. Then once people start to sense that there's conflict, that's the perceived conflict stage. So people kind of start to feel the conflict, but they kind of deny it. They kind of downplay it, like, it's just these guys now, these people not getting along very well. So they feel it, but it's not important enough for them to do anything about yet. If you don't do anything about it at the perceived conflict level, then it'll probably go to the felt conflict level. That's where people in the organization really start to experience it as discomfort. And they really start to, you have a lot of tension, you have a lot of anger that starts to build up over this conflict. This is where the conflict really starts to become dysfunctional. If it's not dealt with at the felt conflict stage, then it's going to morph into manifest conflict. And that's open warfare, where you have members of the organization going at each other. You end up with a winner, you end up with a loser. If you haven't intervened, at least at this point, then that conflict is going to end up becoming destructive for the organization. And that conflict will then result in an aftermath. And so after that manifest conflict has happened, you've had winners, you've had losers. Then in the aftermath, those winners and losers obviously are then going to foster more conflict in the future. And it then starts to become a self-perpetuating situation where the organization is always in a state of conflict. And so the moral of the story for leaders is you need to identify conflict as early as you can and hopefully intervene well before you get to that manifest conflict stage. Because once you get to that manifest conflict stage, then it really does end up becoming that self-perpetuating type of cycle. So let's see, let's move along here to our next one. Oops. So how do you respond to conflict? Well, different leaders will respond to conflict in different ways. And how you respond to conflict will depend upon how you are concerned, how much you're concerned for your own goals versus how much you are concerned for the goals of the group or the organization. So if you have very little concern for your own goals, very little concern for the group or the organization's goals, then you're going to avoid the conflict. You know, leave me alone. I just want to ignore it. I just want to pretend like it's not even occurring. If you have a very high concern for the organization, the group's goals, but not much concern for your own goals, then you accommodate. Then you just kind of give in, okay, you win, you get what you want. If you have a very high concern for your own goals, but not much concern for the organization's goals, then you end up with competition. It becomes a zero-sum game. One wins, one loses. If you are kind of halfway in between on concern for the group's goals, concern for your own goals, that's where compromise tends to happen. You kind of meet the other party halfway and come up with a compromise. Where you would hope to be, obviously, is the Mary Parker-Follett collaboration. High concern for your own goals, high concern for the group goals, and so you collaborate by integrating ideas together to come up with a new way of approaching and solving the problem. Now, obviously, getting to collaboration is difficult, but effective leaders find a way to get from compromise, hopefully, to collaboration. I know we're going really long tonight, and I apologize for that. But just kind of wrap up what we've discussed so far with leadership, and then I want to kind of put a cherry on top of the sundae at the end by pulling all of this together. But where we are now in terms of our discussion of leadership is what leadership means for public organizations. Because again, you can take a leadership class like you're going to do next in the MPA program. You can also take leadership classes in an MBA program. But in the public sector, I think that leadership is different because there are more groups and individuals that are trying to influence decision-making, which means there's more of a need for power sharing. So public leaders need to be able to share power sometimes better than their private sector counterparts because of all the different limitations that they have to face. We know that we have a lot of different employees, different backgrounds, cultures, and interests in a representative bureaucracy, and leaders must be effective in managing those diverse workforces. We also know in the public sector, we have more rules, regulations, reporting requirements, more pressure for accountability, which means leaders have limitations in terms of what they can and cannot do in embedding cultures into an organization. So we're oftentimes dealing with those limitations as public leaders, more so than our private sector counterparts. Many times in this class, we've talked about goals and how goals are much more difficult to define and articulate and measure in the public sector. And so it makes it more difficult for leaders to use path goal theory than perhaps if you were in the private sector. And we also know that tasks in the public sector tend to be much more service oriented, which makes them more information intense. We use a type of technology in the public sector that Thompson refers to as an intensive type of technology, meaning that we are dealing with human beings and we're providing services to human beings. So how we deal with human beings will probably be contingent upon those needs of those individual human beings, which means it's a much more intensive approach to how we do our job in the public sector, and sometimes a much more contingency-based approach in the public sector as compared to the private sector. So I'm not going to say necessarily that public leadership is more difficult than private sector leadership, but we do have to contend with a lot more limitations and a lot more constraints than our private sector counterparts do. But the moral of the story that I really want you to take from this kind of protracted discussion of leadership tonight into your next class is the recognition of situational leadership. That there is no best way to lead, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. How we lead our organizations will be dependent upon the situation, who we are leading, the context of the situation, the time pressures, the level of stress, all those things will contribute to how we lead individuals within our organization. At some points in time, we will want to be more transformational. At other points in time, we will need to be more transactional. It really depends upon the situation. But I know we're running long and we usually take a break, but I want to make sure I get you out of here by 8 o'clock tonight. So if you'll bear with me, let's turn our attention to our final topic, and that's to kind of wrap all of this up and to talk about what organizations need in order to be effective. Because again, at the end of the day, that's what our entire goal is in this course, is to try and enhance the effectiveness of leadership and management in the public sector. So what do public organizations need in order to be effective? Well, the literature tells us there are a lot of things that organizations need to be effective. One thing that organizations need to be effective is they have to have good relationships with their oversight authorities. They have to have good relationships with the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. They need to have oversight authorities that are attentive to the needs of the organization, but yet demanding, because we need them to be demanding to push our organizations further and to push our organizations to be more effective and to do a better job of accomplishing their goals. But we need them to be demanding, but we also need them to be supportive. In a systems resource type of model, we need them to provide us with the resources in terms of personnel and fiscal resources in order to effectively achieve our goals. And we also need oversight authorities who are willing to delegate and that will not micromanage what we are doing as an organization. The more they micromanage, the more difficult it is for us to be effective as organizations. We also have to have effective relationships, not just with our oversight authorities, but also effective relationships with other stakeholders, with the public. We need to have favorable public opinion, as Charles Goodell told us in the case of bureaucracy. We have to have support from the public. We need to have multiple influential constituent and client groups that can be mobilized if the organization needs to mobilize them. Norton Long tells us how important it is for administrators to be able to kind of dabble in the political world to develop the support that they need that they're not getting from political parties. And so one way you can develop that support is by cultivating a constituent group, people who are reliant upon your organization, people who are reliant upon the programs being delivered by your organization. Then whenever appropriation cuts come along in the legislative body, you have this mobilized constituent and client group that's ready to go to battle for you. You need to have effective relationships with your partners and your suppliers, with your contractors who are constructing your buildings for you and providing you with your supplies. You have the effective utilization of technology, matching the technology, appropriate technology to the programs that you are delivering and the job you're doing on a daily basis. You have to effectively negotiate your networks. There's a huge part of the more modern public administration literature that looks at networks, governing networks, in that public organizations are working in networks with nonprofit organizations and sometimes private corporations to deliver goods and services. And so you have to be able to negotiate all these different networks that cut across all these different sectors. In addition to that, to be effective, organizations also have to be responsive to political oversight and influence, but it must be responsive autonomy. You need to keep your autonomy as an organization, but you need to be responsive to political oversight. So you need to be able to and willing to provide the information that political entities want. If it's the executive branch or the legislature, you need to be responsive to their requests. The more responsive you are, the more trust is built. The more trust is built, obviously, the better for your resources as an organization. The better your resources you get, the more likely you are to be effective. Mission balance, the attractiveness of your mission. You need to have missions, as we've talked about before, that are difficult, because that will then push people to work harder and create this tension that will make people work harder and try and be more productive. But they also have to be feasible, so it doesn't cause a great deal of consternation and a great deal of concern when you're not immediately achieving your goals and your mission. Your mission needs to be reasonably clear and understandable. It also needs to be worthy, worthwhile, and legitimate. It needs to be something that people can get behind and people see that there's a legitimate reason for your organization. It needs to be interesting and exciting, important and influential. And a lot of people don't think about this, but your mission also needs to be distinctive. It needs to show why your organization exists and why what you're doing as an organization is not being done by a dozen other organizations in either the public or the private sector. You need to have a strong organization culture, as we've talked about tonight, that is directly linked to the mission and the purpose of the organization. Effective organizations need to obviously have, as we talked about tonight, effective leadership, stable leadership, a multiplicity of leadership, so that you have a cadre of leaders and teams of leaders at multiple levels in the organization. Your leaders need to be committed to the mission of the organization. You have to have leaders that are able to engage in effective goal setting. You need to have leaders who are effective at coping with political and administrative limitations and constraints. You need to have effective task design. You need to have tasks that are intrinsically motivating, that people are interested in, that allow people to grow as human resources, to assume a higher levels of responsibility. You have to have extrinsic rewards where possible for task accomplishment. If you have pay for performance, if you can't do pay for performance, like a lot of our organizations in public sector can't, you have working conditions, you have other things that can be rewards for task accomplishment. And as Room tells us, you need to abide by instrumentality, meaning that those rewards that are promised must be delivered. You have to have an effective development of human resources. You have to have an effective recruitment, selection, placement, training, and development system. Values and preferences among recruits and members that support task and mission motivation. A couple of folks are talking about the problem the organization is onboarding and insufficient onboarding. This is what this is talking about. When you bring new people in the organization, do you have a sufficient onboarding process to acclimate them to the organization's culture and its values and the way in which the organization does its work? Effective organizations oftentimes also tend to have high levels of professionalism among their members, members who have a high level of special knowledge and skills related to task and mission accomplishment, a commitment to task and mission accomplishment, and high levels of public service professionalism. A couple of folks talked about their motivation posting, PSM, public service motivation. You need to have that type of public sector service professionalism and public service motivation. High levels of motivation among members. Speaking of motivation, again, high levels of PSM, high levels of mission motivation among your members, high levels of task motivation among your members as well. So there are a lot of characteristics that we tend to see in organizations that we consider to be effective as compared to organizations that we consider to be ineffective. But to wrap up this entire show, what are some of the commonalities of effectiveness in the public sector? I think the number one commonality of effective organizations is contingency-based management and leadership. We've talked about that ad nauseum tonight, but how you lead, how you manage your organization will depend upon the situation in which you find yourself. Contingency-based management and leadership. Employee involvement, and as we talked about, as Charlie had mentioned, involving people in the development of goals and how tasks are done. The more employee involvement you have, certainly the more potential for conflict that you're going to have to manage, but also the more potential for buy-in to the mission and the operations of the organization. Strategic thinking. Organizations need to think strategically about not just what they are doing, but how what they are doing relates to their environment and how what they are doing relates to the consequences of the beneficiaries of the programs and services that they are delivering. Effective organizations, as we've seen throughout our entire discussion this term, also are very effective at using and leveraging resources. While a systems resource model, they know what resources they need, they know where those resources are in their external, internal environment, and they know how to go out there and obtain those surplus resources. But I think the biggest theme that really ties everything we talked about together in this class in terms of effectiveness is that the search for the magic bullet is dead. The search for the one-size-fits-all approach to make the public sector and public organizations effective, that died with the classical school of organization theory. We understand that it really does depend upon the situation. There's no one best approach, but rather what is the most appropriate approach in this given situation. And I know you're pretty far along in your MPA program, but I hope that's a theme that you'll continue with you throughout the rest of the program, that you're not really looking for the best approach or the best skill or the best technique, but rather you're looking for the most appropriate technique in that given situation. Again, I hope I've justified why my favorite answer to every question is it depends. So I know we didn't take a break tonight. I know we didn't do breakout groups tonight, but I really want to get through all this information so we're able to kind of wrap it all up at the end so you can kind of see why we did what we did this semester. Again, whether we were talking about how you motivate employees or whether we were talking about how you measure effectiveness or whether we were talking about the impact of structure of an organization or impact on how you manage employees on organizational effectiveness, regardless of all the goals and mission statements, all those topics we talked about are all talked about for the purpose of trying to make us more effective. And so I hope that this kind of ties everything together for you. And I hope that the assignment that we've done in this class, as you turn in your chosen solution paper, is not just something that will be practical, but it's something that will allow you to kind of apply a lot of the skills that you acquired in the program to actually identify and resolve a problem in your organization. So I kind of think this class, sometimes I wish this class was kind of at the end of the program so we could take everything and apply everything to your organization. So sometimes it's not the most convenient place in the program for this course, but hopefully it helps kind of pull all the information together you've covered up to this point in the program. And yeah, I hope that no one-size-fits-all approach really is the primary takeaway that you have from this class. If so, then I think I've kind of done my job, at least semi-adequately. So that's it. That's our show. That's everything that I have for you. Again, I apologize for talking so much tonight and not doing breakout groups, but I just want to make sure we got through everything. So you had all the information you could possibly have from the course. So are there any questions or last minute observations about any of this information, the course in general, your final assignment, anything at all?
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I know it's a lot of information, but again, it's kind of like that toolkit that you can just kind of pick and choose what you feel that you need in a certain type of situation. So better more information than not enough. So
Correct. And I would just like to add that, in any organization, introducing change is really difficult and people are still trying to figure out what's the best approach to do so. I was taught more like the freeze, unfreeze, and then refreeze method, which is more like, okay, first we introduce the change, and then first we freeze, and then introduce the change, and then unfreeze it to see if the change takes place, and then kind of like monitor it, and then refreeze it again to make sure that, there's, things are happening. That makes sense. But
yep. Yeah, you're right. It's a very common approach to use. It's just, the recognition that we're going to have to unfreeze it again. We're going to have to do it again in the future. That's not something that's going to, we're going to keep with the same approach for years and years. But you're right. That's exactly the way in which a lot of organizations make those types of changes. That's a great point.
thank you.
Okay, let's see. I think Caesar, you had your hand up first.
No, I think that Ben was first.
Oh, Ben? Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah. Ben?
He might be having trouble with his audio
Ah, okay.
because he's talking, but
Yeah, we can't hear you, Ben. We
Yeah.
can see you talking, but we can't hear you.
Yeah, he's talking about we can.
Yeah, I think it's
Well,
it's an audio problem.
Well, I go when oh no, he's mute now. Okay, so no, I want to tell you thank you for the class. I particularly like the assignment for two reasons. Reason number one is because of the problems that I identified, even the solutions, there are stuff that I have already thought for a long time in my own company. So I had the opportunity to put them in paper, something that I never have done before. So it was just, I was talking about those problems at work, but this class gave me the opportunity to put in paper, in words, right? What I thought about my company, the problems and the solutions that I suggested, right? That's one thing. And the other thing is that the assignment helped me. Also, I like the assignment because also helped me to apply the content of the textbook into specific examples, right? I'm talking about effectiveness, type of leaderships and the like. So for that reason, for those two reasons, I like the assignment. I appreciate that. It was very nice for me.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I agree. I mean, I love the way this assignment allows you to apply things in a practical way. And sometimes we get caught up in MPA programs with theories, and we don't really take the step back and say, how does this really apply? How can we really apply these theories in a practical setting? And I think these assignments kind of allow you to do that. So thank you. I agree with that. Diana, go ahead.
Thank you so much. This is a question of curiosity with leadership and information with this last class. So as someone who, you work within a team, right? And then you go from being a team member or a colleague to being a supervisor, being management. How does one leverage that information tastefully? Because obviously you've built those relationships and you kind of know who's slacking, who's not, what they think of the organization. So now you're moving into that position as being, subordinate, and now you're their supervisor. So without creating chaos of like, hey, I know you don't work. Like, how do you transition into that as a leader, as a former colleague, and seeing how and changing how they view you? You're not a team member now. How do you gain that respect? I'd like to know your insight on that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think that what you said at the end there is how can you change the way they view you? Because if you've been their colleague for a while, their coworker, and now you're a leader, now you're they're your subordinate, they're going to still view you sometimes as being their colleague and their coworker. I guess there are a couple different ways that you can do it. One is probably not the best way, and one's maybe a better way. The not the best way, I guess, would be to you could demonstrate that the authority of your office, and then they would get that indication pretty clearly. Obviously, that's going to create some distrust. That's going to create some problems in your relationship. I think the more appropriate way to do it is to make it clear to them that you understand where they are, you understand the problems that they're facing because you face those problems as well, and you're their advocate. You're their advocate for trying to solve some of those problems now that you're in the position where you can contribute to the solution of those problems. And I think if they can see you as being that not someone who can actually solve the problem, but someone who can contribute to at least putting these problems on the radar of upper level management, then they're going to appreciate that. And then they'll kind of going to see where you are as a conduit between them and upper level management, which will then inherently show your new position, and that they will then understand you're no longer their coworker. But if they see you as an advocate, I think that's kind of how you build that support. They recognize where you are in your position. That's a different position now, but that you're there as their advocate. And I think that's really going to build that support with former colleagues. That would be my advice. But I think that's a great point and great question.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. Who's next? Cesar, do you have your hand? Oh, I think Bernal has her hand up.
Oh, yes, I have a question. I have to turn in, like, my first paper. I had a formatting issue on one of my references. So how do I do that on the chosen paper if I'm adding all three of the papers together? Can I keep the reference separate right under each, like the background paper and the alternative solution, keep the reference page, keep it all together. So you can see I did correct that formatting issue.
Sure, yeah, that's absolutely fine. If you want just, you keep the references with each individual section, that's fine. So yeah,
Okay, great. Thank you.
no worries. Okay, Cesar, go ahead.
Yes, Diana, I actually really liked your question because it's something that I experienced 2 years ago when I became more managerial, and the person that, I used to work with, we had this trust, we had this friendship, and there's just a level of expectation that the other person felt that I shouldn't be, basically directing her or telling her how to do her job. I think it comes down to letting them know, maybe through psychological contracts, or, having a meeting with them going like, hey, I have a role and responsibility to the organization. And I really want everyone collectively to do better. And in order for that to happen, we definitely want the individual to understand that don't take criticism personally. Make sure that, they understand that you're doing your job first and foremost, and that they're comfortable with telling you any issues that they have work related. Unfortunately, my ending didn't end that well, and the person decided to quit. But it was just that shift where I felt like, had I just sat down with her and let her know that, hey, I understand that we have this friendship going on, but if something's wrong, I have to bring it up and I have to hold you accountable as well. And so there was a lot of resistance. And I think it comes with the territory as well, too, because you definitely want to make sure that they know that you're not coming from a bad place. You're just trying to do your job, and you're trying to have everyone collectively like kind of contribute and pull their weight. And I think they would appreciate that, having that like maybe an informal meeting, maybe formalized meeting, I'm not sure. But it can go south and people can turn very nasty. So for instance, I've seen like me giving a directive and they just do the bare minimum. And that happens a lot in the public sector, allegedly, and it happens a lot in the private sector too. So it's kind of like getting them to understand that I'm in a new position, I have a job and a responsibility, just like you have a job and a responsibility. And I'm here to, like what the professor said, like advocate on your behalf, and also like celebrate your wins and encourage you and be your supporter. But at the same time, like if there's something that is wrong, I have to bring it up. And I can't just like address it with you because I want to hide it. If that makes sense. Yeah, and like I want to hide it, so I'm just gonna tell you so that you like do what you got to do. But yeah, it's tricky, and they will expect the communication level differently, and you just have to like set that tone.
Right. It's kind of interesting, and I appreciate your example, because as I'm currently pursuing a higher position, I know my colleague is not doing their job because we've had that relationship, right? And so it's a little awkward now because I know they're looking for other jobs, and I know they're dropping the ball and just completely not doing what they're supposed to. Their numbers reflect that, right? And so in that of curiosity, where it's like, well, if I do push forward within this, it's addressing this again tastefully, sensitive, in a sensitive demeanor with how that conversation can go. So thank you. I appreciate that insight, because I know it can go very left, or it can go quite well.
And the thing is, like, documentation is very important. You know that they're not doing their job, and they
Right.
kind of know that they're not doing their job either. And it's not up to you whether or not they decide to leave or go. I think that's the most important thing. You kind of control what you can control, and what you can't control, you just go, I don't know how they're going to react, but I can control how I address these situations or these.
And their expectations.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, but I will say that like going forward, it is better to document. And hey, the worst thing to have is for them to be hostile towards you. Because I feel like then it's not towards the organization, it's like personal towards you. So not in an envious position, but in my experience, I think that, you know, as long as you let them know, hey, while you're here and you're getting compensated for X, Y, and Z role, right? I definitely want you to be committed, and you could look for, you could do, what are those called? Extracurricular activities outside of it. I think that's fair.
Right.
Mhm.
Wow, well, thank you for all your insight.
Yeah, and one of the things I had to struggle with in that same situation, when I became a department chair, I had a lot of tenured, more veteran faculty. And one of the things I told them is, you know, kind of built this esprit de corps, this, you know, we're in this together as a department. And, you know, when they see that we're all in this together, then I don't have any malicious intent with what I am doing. I'm just, you know, I'm trying to make our department better. And I think that kind of helped get that buy-in on some of those, the part of some of those veteran faculty members. I had some department chair colleagues who went in and decided, I'm getting rid of all the veteran faculty members. And so they gave them 8 a.m. classes on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And that was their strategy to get rid of them. And obviously that created a lot of discontent in those departments. I think you're much better trying to create that, you know, feeling of team that we're in it together. And it's kind of us against the world type of thing, I think kind of helped. Let's see, Aaliyah, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to really thank you for the class. I know a couple of our peers have asked, said the same thing, that this is very practical, and I can see this in the workplace. Great discussion, and just very practicality was the most valued point. And I just wanted to thank you because for me also, like Caesar stated, that it's an idea that I have it down on paper, and hopefully I could, with my other classes, be able to implement it in the workplace.
And thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, I do think that practicality, find that nexus between theory and practice is what this class is all about. And it really should be what an MPA program is all about too. So, Ben, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes. Okay, beat the technology. So I had a question, Professor, on just an overarching thing. This class has been absolutely amazing. I have enjoyed the materials quite a bit. At the same time, I've also been trying to keep myself from getting depressed at how ineffective and bad my own organization is, comparatively to how all the theories on how to be effective are out there. And that my question kind of is along those lines. I see all this research, I've read many case studies, there's so much documented evidence on how things should be done, how they can be done more effectively, and yet when that translates into the real world, it seems like it doesn't actually happen. What is your thought on that? Is it a lack of academia being able to translate into the real world? Is it just people not using the tools that are there? You've been in the real world, so you've seen it. Like, where's the hangup?
That's a great question. I think that the hang up is kind of all the above, in that I do think it's easy to sit and develop theories and talk about theories when you have all the time in the world. But I think when the rubber meets the road in an organization, we have all these time pressures and all these time crunches. It's tough for you to actually implement these theories. So I think that there is a disconnect between the academic world and the administrative world. And I think you don't have really time, or you don't have the energy, or you don't have the support in order to, even if you knew about these theories in a public organization, to implement those theories. And so I think that, you know, you have to prioritize very quickly. And so applying an effectiveness theory is probably not the top priority of that organization. Top priority of that organization is to get the job done and try and survive and keep everyone employed. And, you know, those really start to become your priorities as opposed to abiding by a theory. So I do think there is that disconnect. I don't think we can ever anticipate a situation where we can bring all these theories in and have the time and the luxury to apply them. I think the best that we can hope for is that we have those glimmers of rationality here and there, that when we do have the time and we do have the luxury, we can take bits and pieces of these theories to try and make our organizations more effective. And we're never going to make them completely effective because we have other things that we have to focus on just to keep the trains running on time. And so I really think that's the problem. The academic world is much different than the administrative world. We don't have the same pressures as theorists in the academic world that an administrator will have in the administrative world.
Can I say one thing? I know I didn't raise my hand, but on Ben's point, I hear it all the time here, which is like what you learn in school isn't necessarily what happens and what you apply in the actual like workplace. But I have to disagree. This cohort has been together for well over a year. And I have to say a lot of my cohort, like all of the different classmates that I have such amazing experience at so many different organizations. And I've learned so much from each and every one of you guys. And a lot of the feedback and the input that I've been given from some of my other classmates has been really, really beneficial in this role. So I just want to not only thank you, but also thank my classmates.
Yeah, great point. That's why I love the cohort approach, because I think you do get to know each other very well, and you can actually share the experiences that you've had. And again, not to use Mary Parker Follett too much, but you do get that interpenetration, that integration when you have that type of cohort approach. And so I'm a big fan of the approach used in this program. Cesar, go ahead.
Yes, I wasn't planning to talk again, but I want to piggyback on something that what Ben said, and then what you said, and I agree. Well, one thing is the corporate world, and the other thing is the academic world. I have the opportunity to read a book not too long ago, which is kind of a different book in management, because it has a more like a Machiavellian style of how to build power and approach power. It's called the 48 Laws of Power, right? And it's kind of a bestseller among CEOs. And it's amazing how, for example, one of the laws is never upset your master, right? One of the laws to get power, and how most of the laws to get power are within. It's never make waves. It's always go with the flow, go with what everybody think, never think out of the box if you are alone, because you will be alone. That's what I have learned many years in the corporate world, where there is a lot of conforming bias, a lot of groupings. If you say something different from what the other 20 people say in a group, you pretty much they ask you what planet are you coming from, because they say, so you really need to go with the flow. You really need to go with everybody, and change happens, but it happens very, very, very slow. And that's the way, unfortunately, that many people in management, at least in the private sector, have to build power and make a career inside the companies. If they salute the flag, literally, and they go with the corporate mandate, right? All these things that we're talking about, transformational things, adaptive leadership, and all the stuff, it really is kind of in the books, because in reality, in the real world, is really, you don't salute the flag and you don't go with the flow and go with like everybody said. It's very difficult to really make your place and make a career.
Yeah, and what you're pointing out is very similar to groupthink, is that, if you're not sharing the thinking of the group, if you have a different discrepant type of opinion that the group does not share, then you're ostracized, and the group does everything it can to keep those different opinions from coming to the fore. And that's groupthink, and that's one of the major dysfunctions that we see in a lot of organizations, both in terms of the private as well as the public sector. And so it's important for leaders to try and work against that groupthink, to try and have different points of view, and to try and bring people in from outside the organization, a fresh set of eyes on the problem or the issue. Because once an organization falls into groupthink, then it does become very difficult to have change. And if you do have change, like you're saying, Cesar, it's a very slow and gradual incremental type of change that may not be happening quick enough to benefit our constituents, in the public sector, or our consumers if you're in the private sector. But I think that's a good example of some of the dysfunctions of groupthink. That's good. I know that we're at 8 o'clock, so I guess we're all going to turn into pumpkins now because our 8 o'clock time has come. But thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure working with you. Thank you for all the kind words. both with microphone as well as in text. I really do appreciate it. I am looking forward to reading your chosen solution paper. I've been very happy with the work you've done this term. Great writing, great insights, great critical analysis skills. Very impressed with your cohort, and it's really been truly a pleasure. I will certainly get all those papers and your discussion posts all graded this weekend. I'll have your final grades ready to go no later than Monday, and that will then let you move onward and upward to organization leadership with Dr. Golightly, and I'm sure you'll have a very good experience in that course as well. So thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure. I hope you have a great week. And
Thank you.
again, even as the class ends, if you need anything at all from me, if you have any questions or letters of record or anything like that, you got my email. You know how to reach me. I'm not going anywhere, so I'll still be around. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Thank
See you
you.
next week for our next class. It never ends.
Take care.